Welcome, YouTubers and fellow internet people. Um, Today I'm back for another discussion about storytelling. I was listening to a podcast called, just looking it up here, called The Storyboard, and you can find this over on the Geek and Sundry YouTube channel. It's a podcast put together by Patrick Rothfuss, the fantasy writer. Where he talks about various elements of storytelling, his trade. Last night I was listening to his most recent episode in which he discussed storytelling in video games. Now I've recorded a couple of previous episodes, previous videos about storytelling in video games. The most recent one was really getting into more the mechanics of storytelling as a conversation and how storytelling is inherently interactive. And then I kind of talked about how that works in general in storytelling and then applied that to video games. Today I want to sort of back up and take a more fundamental look at storytelling in video games. And kind of look at how storytelling in video games works maybe differently than it does in other media. So I think the first thing we need to do is talk about the definition of video game. Now, obviously, this is an impossible thing to really nail down a definition for. Video games, the term video game has grown up with the actual thing, video game, during its evolutionary process, and we now have this sort of cloud of things that all sort of stick to the word video game, but it doesn't have clean boundaries, and it contains a lot of dissimilar things. So first of all, I want to object to the word game, because some video games are games, some video games are not games, some video games are puzzles, some video games are really a sort of digital novel that have no game elements whatsoever. So video game is a very, very broad term, and it applies to things like Tetris, which are basically a puzzle that you could probably implement with an hourglass and cardboard cutouts, to things like, say, Bioshock, that are very cinematic. They are far more like watching a movie than playing a game. Like Tetris is kind of like a puzzle. A game like Tetris does not require a narrative. Tetris is not a story. It is not a storytelling medium. It is a game. It is a puzzle. It's not a competitive game necessarily, depending on which implementation you're talking about. So I guess puzzle is maybe even a better word. Then you have things like maybe SimCity, that they aren't really a puzzle. They aren't really a game either. They're almost more like a toy. And I believe Maxis used to talk about their products as digital toys rather than video games or puzzles or narratives. So we're going to have to, if we're going to talk about storytelling in video games, we're going to have to separate all the things that aren't narrative forms. So things like Tetris, things like SimCity, even things that look like they are narrative forms, say like a Call of Duty or a Team Fortress 2 or Counter-Strike. Now there are some small narrative elements to it, but those are truly games. They are competitive mechanic-driven games. They're like chess or basketball. You know, they're a list of rules that you have to follow on your way to completing an objective. So those types of things are games, even though they have some trappings of narrative forms. They really aren't, I think, narrative media. You know, just like a piece of music could very, very much be telling a story, but there are some pieces of music that are not telling a story at all. They might simply be a technical exercise or a technical showcase. So if we're going to talk about storytelling in video games, let's be very specific. Let's talk about those video games that exist as a narrative form, like novels or verbal storytelling, you know, campfire stories or short stories or television or movies, things that are inherently at their core narrative art forms. Now, every one of these media has different particulars. So, you know, a television show, it generally follows a very standard, rigid format. It includes elements like commercial breaks. So scene lengths are of kind of standard dimensions. Just like with video games, we have some standard elements. You know, for example, they are computerized and they have some level of input from the user. So I don't think that element makes it less inherently a storytelling media. You know, just like a book has, you know, has particulars to it. It has pages that you have to turn mechanically. You know, that's a mechanic of a book. But those mechanics are just sort of a part of the medium. They're not really the inherent aspect of it. I feel like I'm kind of rambling here, so let me get more to the point, I guess. Storytelling in video games can be done in a number of different ways. It can be done in a very straightforward, literal way, as it is done in, say, literature. You can have a game with audio or visual narration. Some narrator is telling you, literally telling you the story. Games like this might be World of Goo, for example, has, in between each level, has some scrolling text that gives you the pre-written narrative of the story, and then it's sort of separated by this puzzle gameplay. So World of Goo is kind of an interesting example because it is both a narrative form and a puzzle. But then you can have other games, say like the Deus Ex series, where storytelling is told in a more subtle way. Pieces of overheard conversation, for example, which you could miss entirely if you simply don't visit that part of the game. But in their sum total, they tell a very rich and complete story. But there really is no narrator telling you what's going on. Often there will be some narration at the very beginning, some exposition narration to give you the setup. But then you have other games like, say, Minecraft, which are very open-ended. There is no official narrative at all. And we talked about this in the previous video of how a game like that actually puts the player in the role of the storyteller. And the game developer is no longer the storyteller. They are creating the canvas on which the player can tell their story. So there are many different ways to tell a story in video games. You can have games that are very abstract art games, take the game Flow, and then later Flower by the same developer. I don't have the name of them right off the top of my head, but Flow, for example, is a very abstract game. The player controls a little sea creature like a diatom, and it swims around and eats other diatoms and gets bigger. And there's no human character, no human-like character with which really to identify. But there is a story being told, and the story is being told through the mechanics, through the art, through the soundscape. So you can have very abstract art games that are also telling a story. So I guess the first thing to say is that this category is very, very broad, and there are very, very many different ways to do story in video games. So next, let's talk just briefly about what we've kind of talked about, what a video game is. Well, what is a story? What is storytelling? I think at a fundamental level, storytelling is it's creating alternative realities in the mind. And I think to the mind, if there's any neurologists or neurolinguists or whatever watching this video, wow, that's cool. But you can correct me on this, of course, if I'm way off base. But constructed realities in the mind are essentially the same as the actual reality that we live in. You know, both are the actual reality we live in is one thing, but the reality we perceive and experience is actually all in our head. Our mind is taking input from our senses and creating a model of the world around us, and that model is not always accurate. You know, sometimes we have problems with our senses, and our brain constructs improper models. Sometimes we have other neurological problems in our mind that creates inaccurate models of the world. Sometimes we just are creating a model of the real world in good faith, and we just get parts of it wrong. We make incorrect assumptions about things. So my point here is that the real physical world that we live in isn't really the world that we live in. What we live in is a model of the real physical world that exists in our minds. And when we tell stories to each other, we are creating a model of a world in the audience's mind. So reality and the story are essentially the same thing. And I talked in the previous video about how that model building behavior can be manipulated by clever storytellers, and how excessive use of tropes can destroy a story, because the model that we've constructed in our mind is static. We've already constructed it, and we're just recycling that same model over and over and over. You know, say for a standard action movie trope or a standard first-person shooter type of trope. So storytelling is building this world, this model in our minds. Now, this can be done through words, written or spoken. You know, human beings are very verbal animals, and words are a very direct way to construct a world in somebody else's mind. But you can also do it in more subtle ways. You know, and video games have some really, really cool subtle ways to do this. Say the ambience of a game, the soundscape, ambient noises, the sounds of different things in the world as we move past them, you know, overheard conversation, lighting, you know, the mood that sounds and sights evoke. That can tell a story without any words being involved at all. So those are the subtle nonverbal ways. We can also, not just ambience, but game mechanics can give us give us a hint at the story in a subtle way. I'm trying to think of a good example. And really, the true masterworks of video games are where mechanics and audiovisual elements and narrative all work together very well. Yeah, maybe a kind of a weak example, since I'm just pulling this off the top of my head, is the Deus Ex series, where the mechanic of upgrading the main character with his various powers, that tells the story of this human augmentation in a very upfront way. You actually participate in it. So that's a cool way where mechanic is also telling a story. Or like the game Flow that I talked about, when your diatom eats another diatom, it grows bigger and gains segments, and when it gets attacked by something bigger, it loses segments. So that mechanic is showing you the growth of the story, the growth of this creature that you're sort of shepherding along. So there's lots of different ways to relate story, and ultimately what you're trying to do is evoke a certain model of a certain universe in the audience's mind. So one last thing that I want to hit on here, I think, is the question of the player. What role does the player play in the story? So now I don't mean in this sense what we talked about last time, the audience and the storyteller having a conversation. What I mean is the actual player character in game. Who is that player character, and what role are they playing in the story? Say a game like BioShock. The character that you control has an identity, has a story, and the player, then the human player playing the game, has to shoehorn themselves into that role, right? I mean, the character is a man, for one thing. So if you're a woman playing this game, you have to pretend that you're a man, essentially. Now, BioShock is fairly subtle. I mean, I think you could play quite a bit of this game and not... Well, no, it's fairly gender specific. There are other games where the hero maybe is just not... I shouldn't say hero. The player character is not referred to by gender, so there may be some like that. But, so physical characteristics might be different, and that will make it more difficult to construct this world in the mind of the audience. So, racial differences. Is the character a white guy, but you're a black guy? So that can be an interesting element, because the player, the human being who's sitting down to play these games, has an identity, and they are stepping into a role. So we're doing some role playing here. So mixing it up a little bit can be good, making a man play a woman character in Portal, for example. Could be a valuable and interesting experience to work with. But that's not really involved in the story. That's more of kind of a role-playing identity kind of thing. But when it comes to the story, these characters are pre-written, essentially. You don't have a say in who the character is. There are some games like, say, why am I blanking here? Mass Effect, where you have some choices to make, and so the character isn't entirely, well, it is entirely pre-written, but with some forks. So that gives kind of an illusion that the player, the actual human being, is involved in the game, in the story. But generally speaking, the story is pre-written, and we are just asked to identify with a particular character. And we're asked to do that in a very visceral way. We actually control the motions or the mechanics of that character. In a first-person shooter, it's as if we are possessing the body of this character and moving them around. And, in the role-playing sense, this can be very valuable, I think. It can put us in situations and in roles that we are unfamiliar with. And, just like with children, role-playing is important to develop, I think, empathy and understanding different points of view. And so that can be very positive. But it also can have a negative aspect to it, and that is that we have to shoehorn ourselves into that role, and sometimes that role is not, it's not us, and it's not us on purpose. I'm having difficulty trying to think of how to put this. In a novel, let's take say Game of Thrones, for example, because I'm currently reading that. There are a lot of different characters in that book, and a lot of main characters and tons of secondary characters. But it's very unclear as to who the main character is, right? Who the protagonist is, who you are supposed to identify with. And as I read it, there are actually quite a number of different characters that I can identify with at any given time. In a video game, you don't have that choice, usually. There is a specific character that you have to identify with because that is the character that you are taking over and controlling. So I think this is a somewhat unique element about video game storytelling, is that we have to pick, as the storyteller, we have to pick the player character very carefully, I think. And different games do this in different interesting ways. The Half-Life series does it by having a totally silent protagonist. And in fact, you never even see the protagonist's face. He's given a name and a little bit of backstory. But Valve does a good job of removing some of the barriers to identifying with this character, and making them your protagonist. Other games, I think, maybe do this kind of poorly. Say like the Grand Theft Auto series. You are a hoodlum. You don't really have any choice. You're firmly on one side of the moral spectrum. And that character acts accordingly, and there's no room for, if you, the player, simply don't identify with that character, you identify with one of the other characters. You can't. You're not allowed to in the game. Whereas a novel, you could, identify with whatever character you want. Now there are, novels that are written in a very strict format, I think, that make that more difficult, but video games make it immensely more difficult. So the role of the player, I think, is central to how to tell stories in video games. What is the player? Who are they? And who is the player character that they are asked to control? There are RPGs where you have wide latitude to create a character, both their physical appearance as well as their skill sets and things. And that certainly gives the illusion of choice in who you're identifying with. But the way the story unfolds is not determined by whether your player character is an elf or a human or an orc or a ranger or a wizard, right? Those choices you make are merely flavored. They don't really impact the narrative. So we're coming up on 25 minutes. I think I'm gonna cut this discussion short. I felt like I was rambling a lot. I apologize for that. But I will most certainly pick this topic up again because there's so much to say. I will link to my previous video as well as the storyboard podcast, so you can listen to that if you're interested. yeah, I will do some more thinking about this topic and come back hopefully with formed, a more formed thing to talk about. But yeah, so I'll stick that stuff in the description field. Thank you very much for watching. If you did enjoy this video and my other videos, please like, comment, subscribe. That'll help me keep doing this if I get some response. And I would love to have discussion with people in the comments section, especially about topics like this. So thank you very much, and I will see you next time.